I never wanted to remember the Russian sleep experiment, let alone talk about it. But here I am, finally sharing my story. It's been years, but the memories are still fresh, like it all happened yesterday. I was a broke college student when I saw the ad. The pay was good, and it seemed easy enough. Just stay awake for a couple of weeks while scientists studied us. I figured I'd catch up on some reading, maybe get ahead on coursework. How naive I was. There were 15 of us chosen for the experiment. We were a mixed bunch. Students, job seekers, even a few older folks looking to make some quick cash. We were taken to a facility in the middle of nowhere. The place looked more like a bunker than a lab. All concrete walls and steel doors. The first day wasn't so bad. We were given stimulants to keep us awake and told to entertain ourselves. There were books, games, and a TV. The scientists observed us through cameras and a large one-way mirror. They'd come in every few hours to run tests and take samples. By day 3, things started to get weird. The constant artificial light and lack of sleep were messing with our heads. Colors seemed too bright, sounds too loud. I remember one guy, Mike, getting into an argument with himself in the mirror. He was convinced his reflection was mocking him. A week in, and we were all struggling. The stimulants weren't enough anymore. They started pumping something else into the air, some kind of gas that made our skin crawl and our minds race. That's when the hallucinations started. Sarah, a quiet girl who'd barely spoken all week, suddenly started screaming about spiders. She said they were crawling all over her, under her skin. We couldn't see anything, but she was clawing at herself, leaving long, bloody scratches. The scientists had to restrain her. I tried to keep it together, but it was getting harder. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor rippled like water. I kept hearing whispers, but when I turned to look, no one was there. By the second week, things had gone completely off the rails. Half of us were restrained at all times. The screaming never stopped. I saw Tom, a big guy who'd been a construction worker, bash his head against the wall until he knocked himself out. The scientists dragged him away. We never saw him again. The smell was the worst part. A mix of sweat, blood, and worse things. The scientists stopped coming into the room. They observed us from behind the glass, wearing masks and hazmat suits. I lost track of time. Days and nights blurred together. Sleep deprivation does strange things to your mind. I started seeing shadow people in the corners of the room. They'd whisper things, terrible things. Part of me knew they weren't real, but another part, I wasn't so sure. Around what I think was day 15, all hell broke loose. The power went out for a few minutes. When it came back on, the locks on the restraints had disengaged. That's when the real horror began. The first thing I saw was Lisa, a middle-aged woman who'd been restrained for days, lunging at one of the other subjects. She was like an animal, all teeth and nails. I heard screaming, saw blood. I curled up in a corner, trying to make myself invisible. It was chaos. People were fighting, hurting each other and themselves. I saw Mike, the guy who'd argued with his reflection, trying to claw his own eyes out. He was screaming something about letting the demons in. In the midst of it all, I noticed the observation window had cracked. The scientists were panicking, trying to call for help. One of them made the mistake of entering the room. He was immediately set upon by a group of subjects. I'll never forget his screams as they tore him apart. I don't know how long the madness lasted. Time had lost all meaning. I drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully asleep, but never really awake either. The screams and the smell of blood became my whole world. At some point, I became aware of new sounds, sirens, shouting, the sound of breaking glass. Men in military gear and hazmat suits burst into the room. They were shouting orders, subduing people with tasers and tranquilizer guns. I was too weak to resist as they strapped me to a gurney. As they wheeled me out, I caught a glimpse of the room. It was like a scene from a nightmare. Blood and worse things smeared the walls. Bodies lay motionless on the floor. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me. I woke up in a hospital. They told me I'd been out for days. Of the 15 people who started the experiment, only 4 of us survived. The others had either killed each other or succumbed to the physical toll of extreme sleep deprivation. The next few weeks were a blur of debriefings, psych evaluations, and threats. The government wanted to bury the whole thing. We were sworn to secrecy, told we'd face severe consequences if we ever spoke about what happened. They kept us in the hospital for months, monitoring us, running tests. The nightmares were constant. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that room. I'd wake up screaming, convinced I could still smell the blood. Even after they let us go, we were watched. I'd noticed men in suits following me, cars parked outside my apartment for hours. Phone calls where no one spoke on the other end. It was clear they didn't trust us to keep quiet. I tried to go back to my normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. I couldn't sleep for more than an hour or 2 without waking up in a panic. Loud noises would send me into a tailspin. The sight of blood, even just a small cut, would trigger flashbacks. I lost my scholarship, dropped out of college, couldn't hold down a job. Relationships were impossible. How could I explain why I woke up screaming every night? How could I tell anyone what I'd been through without sounding crazy? The other survivors and I weren't allowed to contact each other, but I often wondered about them. Did they manage to move on? Were they haunted by the same memories? Sometimes I'd see someone on the street who looked familiar and my heart would race, wondering if it was one of them. Years passed. The nightmares never really went away, but they became less frequent. I learned to manage the anxiety, the flashbacks. Found a therapist who specialized in trauma. Couldn't tell her the whole truth, but it still helped. I thought I was doing better, learning to live with what happened. Then came the day I saw him. I was at a coffee shop, just trying to have a normal day. And there he was, one of the scientists from the experiment. He looked older, grayer, but I recognized him instantly. He was sitting a few tables away, reading a newspaper like nothing had ever happened. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. All the memories came flooding back, the room, the screams, the blood. My hands started shaking so bad I dropped my cup. The noise made him look up, and our eyes met. He recognized me too. I could see it in his face. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he stood up quickly, leaving his newspaper behind, and hurried out of the shop. I don't know what made me do it, but I followed him. He walked quickly, looking over his shoulder every few seconds. I stayed back, just keeping him in sight. He led me to a rundown apartment building on the edge of town. I watched him go inside, then stood there, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him, demand answers. Another part was terrified of what those answers might be. In the end, I went home. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. Why was he here? Were they still running experiments? The questions kept me up at night. Over the next few weeks, I saw him a few more times around town, always from a distance. He seemed nervous, always looking over his shoulder. Once, I saw him meeting with a man in a suit in a park. They exchanged an envelope. I knew I should leave it alone. I had a chance at a normal life, or something close to it. Why risk everything by digging into the past? But I couldn't let it go. The need for answers was too strong. So I started watching the scientist, following him when I could. I took notes on his routines, the people he met with. One night, I saw him leave his apartment in a hurry. He was carrying a briefcase and looking more nervous than usual. I followed him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I don't know what I expected to find, but it wasn't this. The warehouse was full of equipment, similar to what I remembered from the experiment. There were beds with restraints, monitors, tanks of gas. And papers, so many papers. I started looking through them, my heart racing. They were continuing the experiments. Different locations, smaller groups, but the same horrible tests. And worse, they were refining the process, looking for ways to push people even further. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't hear him come back. Suddenly, there he was, the scientist, standing in the doorway, staring at me in shock. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he spoke, his voice shaky. "You don't understand. We're so close to a breakthrough. The things we've learned." I didn't let him finish. All the anger, all the pain of the past years came rushing out. I lunged at him, my fists flying. He went down easily. He was older now, and I had surprise on my side. As he lay there, groaning, I grabbed as many papers as I could and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment. My hands were shaking as I looked through the documents. It was all there. Proof of ongoing experiments, lists of test subjects, results. I knew I had to do something with this information. I couldn't let them continue, couldn't let anyone else go through what I did. But I also knew how dangerous these people were. If I went public, would anyone believe me? And what would happen to me if they found out? As I sit here now, writing this all down, I still don't know what I'm going to do. But I know I can't stay silent anymore. The world needs to know the truth about the Russian sleep experiment. Not just what happened then, but what's still happening now.